Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Mariana Siciliano, Managing Educator for Public Programs, and I am delighted to welcome you to Sunday at the Met, a long-running program that offers insights into the museum and its exhibitions through lectures, conversation, films, readings, demonstrations, and more. We are excited to celebrate the exhibition Caspar David Friedrich, The Soul of Nature, which is on view in Gallery 199 through May 11th. I'd like to extend our gratitude to Marina Kellen French for making the exhibition possible, and for the support of the Janice H. Levin Fund, Art Mentor Foundation Lucerne, Barbara A. Wolf, an Anonymous Foundation, the International Council of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and Trevor and Alexis Trena. Corporate sponsorship is provided by Sparkassen Finanzgruppe and Allianz X. The exhibition is supported by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities. Caspar David Friedrich reimagined European landscape painting by portraying nature as a setting for profound spiritual and emotional encounters. The vision of the landscape that unfolds in his art, meditative, mysterious, and full of wonder, is still vital today. Today's program is an opportunity to consider our ongoing and changing relationship with the natural world, how artists capture this unique dynamic, and how we consider timely issues in an evolving natural environment with a range of experts across disciplines. We'll begin our program with an exhibition overview by co-curator Joanna Scheer-Seidenstein, assistant curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints. We'll then hear a conversation between Alison Hokanson, curator in the Department of European Paintings and exhibition co-curator, as well as Lisa Switkin, Anne Millet, moderated by Ulrich Beyer. It's my pleasure to tell you more about today's guest speakers. Anne Millet is an internationally renowned photographer based in Brooklyn. Her work addresses the historical complexities found within photography's relationship to conflict. A recipient of prestigious fellowships from the MacArthur and John Simon Guggenheim Foundations, Lay has exhibited her work extensively. Her major solo exhibitions include those at the Carnegie Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Milwaukee Art Museum. In 2023, the Museum of Modern Art in New York organized Between Two Rivers, a comprehensive 30-year survey of her career. She currently holds the Charles Franklin Kellogg and Grace E. Ramsey Kellogg Professorship in the Arts at Bard College, New York. Lisa Switkin is a partner at Field Operations, a leading landscape architecture and urban design studio based in New York City, where she leads many of the firm's complex public realm projects. With a background in community advocacy, urban planning, and landscape architecture, Lisa is committed to improving cities through the design of resilient, holistic, and vibrant public realm inspired by place, people, and nature. Whether revitalizing post-industrial waterfronts, reimagining infrastructure, or creating neighborhood parks, her work demonstrates an exceptional sensitivity to context while boldly reimagining what public space can be. Lisa is a past president of Landscape Architecture Foundation and currently serves on the board of Urban Design Forum. Our moderator, Ulrich Beyer, is university professor and director of the Center for Humanities at NYU. A recipient of Getty, Humboldt, and Guggenheim fellowships, Beyer has published books on poetry, photography, and other topics, including What Snowflakes Get Right, Free Speech, Truth, and Equality in the University, Oxford University Press, Spectral Evidence, The Photography of Trauma, MIT Press, The Dark Interval, Letters on Loss, Grief, and Transformation, Random House, and translations of work by Nietzsche, Freud, and Rilke. He hosts an ideas podcast called Think About It, and is editorial director at Warbler Press, where he has written introductions from over 30 classic works of literature, from Pride and Prejudice to A Farewell to Arms. We are thrilled and grateful to have each of our speakers with us today. To begin the program, please join me in welcoming Joanna Scheer-Seidenstein to the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Mariana, and thank you all for being here today. As Mariana said, I had the pleasure of co-curating, together with Alison Hokanson, the exhibition Caspar David Friedrich, The Soul of Nature. But let us begin briefly, not with Friedrich, and rather with some more recent landscape imagery. Photographs that capture the beauty and mystery of the natural world, the sublime and haunting qualities that prompt our psychological, existential, and even spiritual reflections on the world and our place within it. These are photos that Allison and I received, and in a couple cases took, while working on this exhibition, precisely because of their kinship with Friedrich's landscapes, which, as this show explores, are among the earliest pictorial expressions in Europe of a belief in a profound connection between nature and the inner self or soul. Working in the early 1800s in what is now Germany, at that time a constellation of separate aristocratic territories, Friedrich was in the vanguard of a movement known as Romanticism, a cultural revolution that emphasized individual experience and perception, subjectivity, emotion, and spirituality, and that recognized nature as a site of personal discovery. Friedrich's landscapes thus return us to a watershed moment in the rise of modern perceptions of nature. To give you a brief overview of the artist's life, Friedrich, whom we see here in a self-portrait at about 25 years of age, was born in the town of Greifswald on the Baltic Sea, and after a period of training there and then up north in Denmark at the Royal Academy in Copenhagen, Friedrich returned to the German lands in 1798 and settled in the flourishing artistic center of Dresden, which he would call home for the rest of his life. Making frequent sketching expeditions in the surrounding mountains and countryside, as well as back along the Baltic coast near his hometown, it was this terrain, as you can see, a rather small slice of present-day Germany, that Friedrich reimagined in hundreds of paintings and drawings, together forming one of the most distinctive bodies of landscape in the history of Western art. With a selection of 76 of his works from more than 30 lenders in Europe and North America, including the 3 largest collections of the artist's work in Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg, this exhibition traces Friedrich's creative path over the entirety of his 4-decade career, a period in which war, shifting borders, early industrialization, advances in the earth sciences, and the rise of environmental consciousness transformed the way people understood the land as both a political and physical entity. The exhibition begins with the early exploratory work Friedrich made as he began his career in Dresden, just as early romantic ideas about nature and the self were starting to circulate widely. We see him seeking ways to express pictorially the idea of nature as a site of emotional experience, initially in a somewhat overt fashion, with obviously melancholic and despairing figures in the landscape. But then, through his growing practice of drawing outdoors from direct observation of nature, developing the sensitivity to light, atmosphere, and vantage point, with which he invested the landscape itself with feeling. Here we have at left a drawing by Friedrich, and at right, one by an older artist working in Dresden, Johann Gottfried Jentsch. Both works depict the same site, a natural rock arch about 3 miles long and at points extremely narrow. But right away we can see how different in feeling they are. Friedrich does away with excess detail and distraction and instead marshals the expressive power of light and perspective, deploying broad passages of wash and the untouched paper to create a sense of the brilliant luminosity in which just 2 tiny figures in the distance revel. Mere silhouettes with no specificity of costume, class, gender, and no delineation of their facial expressions, these figures invite us not to read the reactions so much as to feel the rush they experience as they greet the open air and bright light, having made their way through the dark and narrow arch. Friedrich, in fact, made his name as an artist with large-scale ink and wash drawings of this kind, publicly exhibiting examples like this one at the Dresden Academy. With these works, Friedrich dazzled critics with his technical virtuosity, his ability to render an atmospheric landscape in a monochrome medium, again using the untouched paper to convey luminosity, in this case of the moon and its reflections on the rippling water. The reviewers were equally struck by the palpable mood and emotion, the feelings of melancholy, solitude, and longing, all conveyed in the complete absence of figures by and through the landscape itself. It was only in 1808, so 10 years into Friedrich's time in Dresden, that he began to publicly exhibit oil paintings. These works similarly exhibit an extraordinary treatment of light, mood, and now color, along with an increasing interest in compositional symmetry and overtly religious imagery. Crosses, crucifixes, and ecclesiastical and monastic ruins. In Friedrich's hands, vehicles for profound meditations on the intersection of Christian spirituality and the natural world, and on the endurance of faith. Emblematic of true commitment to faith and of the solitude and mysticism that the Romantics prized was the figure of the monk, here depicted by Friedrich in one of his most celebrated works, on loan from Berlin to the United States for the very first time. This large painting, almost entirely made up of sky and startling still today for its powerful minimalism, was absolutely mind-blowing in 1810. And in fact, because of its radicality, it was a great success, striking a chord with the public and with critics. One famously remarking that looking at the picture was so shocking, it was like having one's eyelids cut off. Ultimately, the work spoke to the zeitgeist for the feeling and mood it evoked, and for its open-endedness. The idea that art was subject to personal interpretation, something we take for granted today, was really just emerging in this period. And Friedrich encapsulates this idea with an image of confrontation and contemplation of the horizon, above which a sky, at once brooding and luminous, unfolds, with no clarity about which conditions will prevail. As Friedrich himself put it, the work is about the unknowability of what lies beyond, the future, death, and all that which transcends human comprehension. From this quintessential image of solitude, the exhibition proceeds with a look at the community in which Friedrich, himself quite a social and well-connected guy, pursued his career, the colleagues with whom he exchanged ideas, and the friends with whom he conducted many of his sketching expeditions, sharing the experience of being alone together in nature, an experience he occasionally commemorated in his work. As well as his family, his wife Caroline and the couple's 3 children. Here, Friedrich depicts Caroline at his studio window, one of his iconic Rückenfiguren, meaning figures seen from the back. A motif with a long history in European art in the form of small ancillary figures meant to involve the viewer in the scene depicted, usually through gesture, Friedrich accorded these figures central roles and invested them with such psychological interiority. Their contemplation of the landscape becomes the real subject of the picture. Here, precisely because we cannot see Caroline's facial expression or the landscape she beholds through the window, our own psychological engagement is elicited. It gets our mind wandering and wondering about what it is she sees and thinks, ultimately making clear that those things are inaccessible to us. Throughout the first decade of Friedrich's career, the Napoleonic Wars were raging through Europe, with much German territory, including Dresden, subject to French occupation, brutal battles, and bloodshed. After their conclusion in 1815 and the liberation of the German lands, political borders were redrawn and new alliances emerged, complicating notions of home and homeland. Emerging in Friedrich's work in this period is a dichotomy between the familiar and unfamiliar, the nearby and the distant. Reflections on the German concepts of Heimweh and Fernweh. Heimweh denoting something close to homesickness, a longing for home and the familiar. Fernweh, with no equivalent in English, the opposite, longing for distant places, for being away. Whether depicting something as familiar as his hometown of Greifswald, or as far off as the icy North Sea, or figures on the shore watching boats coming in, Friedrich captures that sense of yearning, of always being at a distance from where one wants to be. The war years also prompted heightened interest in the passage of time, the cycles of the day and year, as well as the cyclical nature of human history. And here we go back in time for a moment to a drawing from 1813, the height of war in Dresden, when Friedrich took refuge in the town of Krippen, and there made this watercolor of an active quarry. But what at first glance looks like rubble. And of course, quarries are landscapes created through a kind of taking apart of nature, the cutting and harvesting of natural stone in order to redeploy it in and as architecture. And so amidst war, as new ruins were being created around him, Friedrich gives us this conflation of construction and destruction, a meditation perhaps on human ambition and engineering as both at once. The intersection of human endeavor and the rhythms of nature continued to fascinate Friedrich. About 1820, upon his election to the Dresden Academy, the artist submitted this work as his official reception piece. Although landscape had, largely thanks to his efforts over the previous decade and a half, grown in esteem and stature, it was still a pretty bold move to submit a painting of a giant rock. The complete opposite of traditional history painting, storytelling through human action. But this still, static rock was not just a bold move, but also a very clever one, because of course it's not just a rock, but a dolmen, a prehistoric rock formation. You can see a large boulder set atop smaller ones, created by ancient Germanic tribes, most likely to mark a tomb, a burial site. And so here we have a natural motif embedded with thousands of years of history associated with human death, mourning, and one that has endured, and that endurance through the years put into relief by the autumnal windswept landscape around it, the turn of the seasons, the cycles of nature being something that this stone, this dolmen, has witnessed thousands of times. And so with this landscape, a statement, Friedrich makes a statement that landscape has the capacity to articulate ideas about humanity and about the world as profoundly as history painting. So too did Friedrich consider how the cycles of the natural world could be disrupted. These paintings, exhibited by the artist as a pair in 1828, present commonplace subjects, a group of spruce trees and a clump of leafless bushes, the evergreen juxtaposed with the always changing deciduous, both coated with freshly fallen snow. In reality, actually quite small, these are monumental in impact. Their insistent symmetry, the framing of the forms within the canvases, create a dynamic such that in the absence of a Rückenfigur, a figure seen from the back, it is as if our viewing and contemplation has become the subject of the pictures. These works also speak to the growing ecological consciousness of the period, likely depicting tree nurseries on the Dresden Heath, created in the period because of overlogging and a dwindling supply of timber. They register an awareness not just of a changing landscape, but of the role of humans in precipitating that change and the need to compensate. At the same time, in this period, as geology emerged as a discipline, Friedrich and his contemporaries were confronted with the idea that the Earth was far older than previously believed. Mountains and rock formations thus took on new significance, their enormity and stratified layers of stone, visual manifestations of this unfathomable expanse of time in which human history formed but a small fraction. In this most famous, iconic image by Friedrich, and really most iconic work of all of German Romanticism, The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, also here in the US for the first time, we see a traveler looking out over a mountainous landscape in which such rock formations and distant peaks are shrouded in mist, making it difficult for him to apprehend the landscape. Again, there's that sense of unknowability, that the earth is somehow beyond full comprehension. He experiences grandeur, but also uncertainty, thus encapsulating the romantic concept of the sublime, the experience of beauty and danger, fear, all at once. The last two sections of the exhibition trace the final decade of Friedrich's life and career, when his work was falling out of favor. Public taste was shifting away from his suggestive, enigmatic landscapes toward more overt, even grandiose visions of nature. But Friedrich stuck to his principles, even setting them down in writing in this period, articulating the commitment that we've seen throughout his career to open-endedness, as he put it, space for the imagination to play, and to landscape imagery in which the essence of nature and the artist's own soul are reflected. In his very final years, Friedrich returned to the materials and motifs with which he launched his career. Failing health notwithstanding, he continued to innovate in these late works, pushing landscapes to its limits, in a sense literally, whether a view of the horizon across an empty shore, an expanse of water, or the depths of a cave surrounded by intricate rock face. Both confront us with the threshold, the limits of our own apprehension, the depths of the cave interior that we cannot see, or the horizon past which we cannot see. In both, the complete absence of figures or even signs of human activity disorients any sense of scale. There's also nothing anchoring us in a specific time. These could be primordial landscapes or projections far into the future. Ultimately, we are offered maximum space for our imaginations to play. And like the monk in Friedrich's 1810 masterpiece, we confront that unknowability of what lies beyond. With that, I am delighted to invite to the stage Ulrich, Allison, Anmi, and Lisa. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much, everybody. And if you may join me in another round of applause for our tremendous co-curators. Really a remarkable achievement, this show, and I would love to have our two distinguished guests. So Lisa and Anmi, thank you so much for joining us, and Allison. And I thought, Lisa, if you start, I'm the moderator, so I'll stay out of the way as much as I can. So maybe Lisa will start, then Anmi, then Allison, and then we'll have a conversation. And I want to thank all of you for coming and participating in this immersive, amazing experience. The show is so beautiful and poignant and enveloping. Allison and Joanna, congratulations, it's really fantastic. So Lisa's going to start, right? So can dive right in, okay?
Sure, thank you. I'm very excited to be here with all of you. And I just wanted to start by saying a few things about field operations. As was said in the introduction, we're a landscape architecture and urban design studio based in New York. And I wanted to, do I have the slide? Oh, sorry. And I wanted to start by sort of probing a bit this question of our evolving relationship with nature. And at Field Operations, our work is really about the intersection and the integration of nature and culture, and the role of design in actually connecting people with nature and with place. And I was inspired by the words, Joanna's words in the foreword for this exhibition, and this idea of showcasing and exposing the complexity and vulnerability of landscape. And so I wanted to start by thinking about core foundational landscape theories and principles that really ground our work and that I also think have a relationship to landscape painting and art. So one is this idea of intimate immensity. For example, our work on the High Line, you sort of understand and feel the High Line in both its sort of relationship to the city as a linear corridor, but also this sort of the small and the big, the sort of deep textures and remnants of the existing rail tracks, et cetera, that were sort of left. You feel that, I think, both when you understand its presence in the city, but also the sort of intimacy of being enveloped in its structure, for example, here at the 10th Avenue Square. Or when you're walking along the promenade, both being sort of nested and this kind of intimacy of being surrounded and immersed in plant life, and at the same time having the sort of scale of the city and the buildings beyond. Another core principle is this notion of prospect and refuge. Again, it's playing a little bit with the big and the small, so understanding not only the sort of holistic relationship, but something that was also brought up in Joanna's introduction about the idea of the emotional response or the personal response. And so this idea of understanding your place in the surrounding sort of context, in the surrounding neighborhood, in the surrounding city here, of course, in Hong Kong, and at the same time having these moments where you're more enclosed and protected. Or how this works, for example, in one of our projects at the Presidio Tunnel Tops in San Francisco, this moment of prospect, the sort of the drama and the beauty of course, the Golden Gate Bridge and the bay beyond, and at the same time creating these moments to be sort of enclosed and sheltered within it. Or at Tongva Park, again, this kind of notion of not only pronouncing from the street, but also having this kind of more human-scaled space to kind of view that vista within. Another key concept is one of the borrowed landscape, and this is about integrating design with the surrounding context and sort of amplifying or building on what is already there. I think for landscape architects in particular, you know, there is no such thing as a tabula rasa. Everything is sort of about its context and its specificity. And the borrowed landscape is not only about using and amplifying what is there, but it goes down to the sort of craft and materiality and particularity of every place. So this is a project in Miami, the Underline. And again, sometimes that's about the city, sometimes that's about infrastructure that's there, and sometimes it's about natural systems such as the East River at Domino Park. Another idea is one about a time-based approach, and this is not only having to do with seasonality, but also with the sort of daily rhythms, not only of people, but in this case of the tides at Gansevoort Peninsula in the Hudson River Park, or at Freshkills, the sort of process of reclaiming the once landfill. And again, the kind of notion of seasonality, and this isn't just the seasons. In fact, it's much more intricate than that. I think for anyone who has spent time on the High Line, you can go up almost week by week, and the landscape shifts and changes. And this idea of a time-based approach is not only about how you experience the place, but it's also, as landscape architects, I think we have something that we call the long view or a growth mentality. It's about sort of understanding the sort of scale of time and landscapes maturing and growing over time. The concept of the layered landscape, and for this what I mean is not only that every site is sort of rich with stories and histories, but at the same time it goes down to even their sort of the making of the site and the materials, the sort of earth, the ground, et cetera, that goes into how you design. And that layered landscape is something that, again, in every place we sort of reveal different components and stories. It's also programmatic layering. So here in a sort of quite narrow strip on the southern side of Gansevoort Peninsula, you start to see the idea of the beach, the walkways, the lawns, the sports courts, et cetera. And the layering also has to do with a sort of verticality. While landscape is mostly seen as horizontal, in this day and age, landscapes are more and more being built on structure, over things, bridging things. And so this is a project, the Overlook Walk in Seattle, where you start to see this idea of the layered landscape literally sort of uplifting, lowering, and then reconnecting sort of the community in the downtown to the Elliott Bay. This idea of immersive experiences, and I think this comes through very much in Friedrich's paintings, but you know, this is about the tactile and the sort of haptic and this kind of immersive quality that landscapes gives, and really your experience on the ground, whether that is immersed in planting or in, for example, the previous one, in sort of a fog or water, immersed in the timber bridge on the Highline Moynihan connector. And it also is this idea of sparking curiosity and discovery and wonder. And this is something that is embedded throughout our work, whether it's in each one sort of is relative to the place that it's at. So that image I just showed before, you know, the cranes of the Domino Sugar Plant are sort of very vivid. This was working with an artist on a project in Taupu to build these tunnels that were based on sort of a craft very much of that place. And, you know, this idea of discovery and wonder also being about discovery and wonder of the natural world. So these are a series of, you know, mudflats, actually, that are part of the building of the landscape. And we sort of took a channelized river and allowed for it to sort of have its natural flows. Or the moment when you sort of come up to the Garden of the Sky, the sort of secret garden moment on the High Line. And finally, I wanted to sort of end with this notion of everyday life. We were talking a little bit before this, and I was mentioning how, you know, our work and our projects are never finished, of course, but they're their best when they're populated and sort of used by people. And so the work itself is also very much attuned to kind of not only understanding the rituals and sort of everyday life, but in many ways, they're a series of invitations or prompts for people to kind of make them their own. And I think this also maybe goes back to this idea of the viewer, of art and the role of the viewer, and how in many ways it's to spark imagination, something that Joanna also mentioned. But not only spark imagination, but also kind of allowing people to sort of overtake the projects and make them their own.
Thank you. And me. Yep.
All right. I should start by explaining that I came to this country when I was 15 as a Vietnamese refugee, and we never thought we could return to Vietnam for many, many years. And I think living in exile makes you kind of yearn for things that, you know, were in your homeland, things that you're missing. And it's kind of this accumulation of memories and compounded things and selective memory that accumulates. And in 1995, when President Clinton renewed relations with Vietnam, Vietnamese Americans were able to return safely. And I was, by then, a photographer. I was not trained as a photographer. I was trained as a scientist. That was the obvious step, is to return to Vietnam. And I really had no idea what I would do. I certainly was not a landscape photographer, but as soon as I got there, somehow the landscape made sense to me. I would say I became an accidental landscape photographer. I was working with a large format view camera, which is this kind of 19th century style camera that's on a tripod. It's kind of like a box. You use sheet films. You put a dark cloth over your head. You know, the whole thing. So it's cumbersome. It's slow. You know, but it describes the world the way I liked to describe it through my prints. And so I arrived in Vietnam with this camera, and I realized that I was experiencing the landscape without a camera in front of my face because of my apparatus. And I was wandering around and having these experiences. And the experiences that I cherished the most were the ones that reminded me of something I had not experienced because of the war. So I grew up in Saigon, which is a safe place in the city. My family's from northern Vietnam, which is very specific, and that's where Vietnamese culture comes from. And I did not experience that because we moved south. So being in the north and seeing that landscape somehow connected me to the past. And I started looking for those moments. And what did that mean to look at the past? It meant looking at agrarian culture, things that were made by hand, things that were mysterious. So here you have trellises about, with growing tomatoes. You have brick factory that looks like ruins. And so all those things come together to talk about contemporary Vietnam, but also about the past. Something that I kind of understood intuitively is the notion of scale and also the notion of how to describe space. You go from a three-dimensional thing, you go from an experience, and you kind of compress that into a two-dimensional image that is then printed. It's problem solving. You have the horizon line, you have things, you have people, so how do you manage all of that? And it becomes a kind of problem solving. I think that I experience things and hear, as a photographer, you encounter things that happen, you have limitations, you can't completely fabricate, but you can ask people to move, you can put things together that are not together. And so I had this sense, as I was visiting the delta of the Mekong for the first time, that I wanted some sort of peaceful, kind of strong unity. And I kind of created this fictional family by putting these people inside this harbor. The camera, because it's view camera, doesn't record instantaneous moments. So you have this blur that happens that reminded me of, helicopters landing in the delta of the Mekong during the war. And so it was a confluence of things that just sort of happened and created this experience that I tried to transcribe. I would say that I'm a quasi-documentarian. Things happen, unexpected things happen, and it's about balancing the act and finding a way to kind of redescribe that, using drawing, using points of view, using perspective, and mixing all of those things together. After Vietnam, where I was not at all interested in exploring the notion of war, we invaded Iraq in 2003, and I felt really compelled to talk about that. I was not able to go to Iraq, but I went to this place outside of Los Angeles where the Marines train before they get sent off to Iraq. So it's kind of this liminal space where you train to try to get something right. I don't think you can train for war before you get sent off. It's all live fire. And I think this is when I started reaching for the notion of the sublime, because being a landscape photographer, everything is sort of has a good perspective, it's balanced, and perhaps the notion of beauty starts seeping in, and it made me really, really uncomfortable. And I think the notion of the sublime, that kind of troubling beauty, the destabilizing beauty is something that became important when I started doing this work. This experience I had was probably closest to what was sublime. And so it's a night operations, live fire. The Marines sent in jets, dropping bombs, howitzers, mortars. You had Marines in the foxholes shooting, everything had tracers. So this is an experience that somehow was incredibly perverse, aestheticized, frightening, but safe. I didn't know how to process it. And I think part of the idea of the sublime is you don't understand what's happening and you try to make sense out of it. But I did try to kind of find it, an allegory for the experience. It's a 20-minute exposure, so it records things over time, multiple explosion, multiple traces. It's about abstraction. It's about space. It's about the past and the future, and it's something violent at the same time peaceful. I was invited to visit a ship at sea, and I then continued this project. And I think now I wanted to really look at trying to describe the military-industrial complex, which I think is undescribable. And I came up with the idea that perhaps I could describe fragments of it. The ocean makes sense to me because it's a kind of untamable power. It's about borders. It's about human endeavors. It's about frontiers, and also, you know, many Vietnamese were also evacuated by sea at the end of the war, and so it's something that was always fascinating to me. This picture is about perhaps human folly, you know, using military equipment to make land art, perhaps. The confrontation of a greater force with a different kind of culture, you know, that power disparity is something that I encountered a lot and wanted to describe. It's not quite the Rookin figure because I'm higher above looking down, perhaps, you know, the commander looking down, God looking down. But I would see these kinds of interactions a lot and try to describe them. It's about American adventurism. This picture is not a landscape, even though I do think of it as a landscape because I think it's about scale. And it's important to me because I think it talks about how photography, and I love this aspect of photography, how paradoxical it is, how it can describe something so clearly and so well in such details, but then, you know, how objective it is, but then it's also has the capability of suggesting the subjective, something beyond the frame of the image. And you know, you have this was taken on a hospital ship. The nun's a patient, and you have a Navy officer here. And I think it's two parts of the world that are so far apart that are brought together, and perhaps seeking connection, and perhaps it's about spirituality. You know, spiritual art is kind of not very fashionable. This is part of a new project which is unfinished that involves, it's a kind of American road trip. And it involves a lot of monuments being taken down, and it talks about the Civil War, it talks about how we misunderstand each other during these very politically fraught moments. I think Robert Musil said that one of the most invisible thing in the world are monuments. And this is another project that was started recently, and it accompanies my interest in a nuclear arsenal. And I thought that perhaps looking at the sky, looking at the infinite would be a great companion piece to photographs of nuclear silos. And so here you have civilization and the infinite together. And here's another night landscapes. I think that I've realized that I'm somewhat of a romantic photographer from doing the research and reading more about Friedrich. And in many ways, you know, I think that I've been dealing with subjects that are greater than myself, that I don't understand. And it's about trying to make sense out of that and not always being able to. And so I have experiences, and of course they are influenced by my background, my baggage. I think they're interesting experiences. I try to somehow transcribe them in a photograph. I don't, you know, I think my experience is definitely subjective, and I don't expect the viewer to have the same experience. But my goal is really not to simplify the subject matter or simplify my experience. And I'm very much open to letting the viewer kind of have their own experiences when looking at my photographs.
Thank you. Allison, what's remarkable, we have two practitioners. So Lisa, you actually design experiences, and I will ask you a little bit about how much you want to actually leave the visitor to have their own personal version of conquering the space and making that space their own, and how much you want to direct and choreograph. And me, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the limits that you've invoked here of comprehension. And in Friedrich, there are a lot of limits. There's a horizon, there's the sea, there's what we can know. Sometimes you're on the edge of a cliff. And maybe since you're two practitioners, Allison, if you can touch a bit on what Friedrich was actually doing, since he was in some ways using the landscape, but also really manipulating it. And none of those pictures there, you cannot really find them. They're composites. So maybe you can talk a little bit how he didn't just stand there and say, this is the landscape, here's my painting, but he created something. And you both are relying on the given world, and then you turn it into something new. So maybe you can talk about his practice a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we? Yeah, can I have the clicker? That way we can have a little video. I think. Let's see. What's a good one to talk about? Perhaps. Can you even do? This one is a good one to talk about. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you to both of you. As you know, Friedrich died in 1840, so in putting together this exhibition, we did not have the advantage of hearing him reflect on or explain his own work or his own creative practice as we do with you. But at the same time, I do kind of take heart because in this work, The Monk by the Sea, that you can see on the right, he said that he was trying to capture the unknowability of the future and also the vanity of human ambition and thinking that we could dictate what kind of traces we would leave behind for future generations. And he also said something that's really extraordinary for an artist working in his period when painting was still art was still supposed to convey a message. It was supposed to have a moral. It was supposed to have a meaning. He thought that one of the greatest achievements of an artist would be to make works of art that were open-ended and to which the viewer brought their own experiences, their own thoughts, their own emotions. And so I think it's great for us to then be carrying that forward today and to be talking about the themes in his work that still hold relevance for us now. And it's actually been very interesting, both in reading the critical response to this show and also in talking anecdotally for people. Even if we start out thinking and talking about Friedrich's work, I find that what we end up thinking and talking about is actually our own time and our own moment. And so I think there will be, both of you talked about time. I think there will be very interesting back and forth in this conversation about these moments. So I've totally disregarded your question, but now I will answer it. So Friedrich goes, he sketches out in nature. He's a compulsive sketcher. His sketchbooks are filled with hundreds of drawings of pine trees and tree roots, all of which to me look exactly the same, and rock formations. He comes back to his studio and he then creates the kind of landscapes that you see here, and they are imaginary. He will very freely combine landscapes that he drew decades apart, 400 miles apart, in totally different parts of the landscapes. And he says in the writing that we do have by him that the role of a work of art is not to replicate the landscape as we see it, but to capture, as Joanna said, the spirit, right, of nature and the memories and the emotions and the aspirations and the beliefs that we imbue into the landscape. And you're absolutely right, Ulrich. They have now bike tours. You can go on Friedrich walking tours. And sometimes people get to these spots and they're very disappointed. They say, this is it? It's anticlimactic because they're not spaces that exist kind of purely in nature, right? These are artistic spaces. This is a landscape that exists in his imagination and in which he tries to create room for our own imaginations.
He creates these experiences, and Joanna writes in the catalog, sort of, I just want to quote Joanna, she said, "You're neither fully immersed in nature or the image, but you're also not totally focusing on the performance of his art, but you're left somewhere in between." An awareness that this is maybe an artificial construction. The way in which to think about this, maybe the word landscape probably means an environment that we ascribe some kind of meaning to. The meaning could be an enemy, strategic meaning entirely, just seeing where you can position yourself to win the battle, which is one way of thinking about the landscape, or where you can actually escape, removing yourself from the north to Saigon or something like that. The landscape viewed as inherent in meaning versus the environment, which doesn't have meaning. It's actually meaningless. And to go to this, it's open-ended. He invites us to project all sorts. Your essay sort of says how much Friedrich has allowed people to imagine their own versions of art into this, and yet he places us quite precisely in relation to these paintings. So the grove of spruce trees, or whatever the trees, you cannot really stand to the right or to the left of that painting and get it. You're standing in a position that painting puts you in, which Joanna pointed out. There's no longer this Rückenfigur, but you all are that figure here now standing in relation. So there's both open-ended, you can see what you wish, there's the horizon infinitely receding, and yet you are placed in this position from which you are doing this activity, the meditative. So I'm kind of curious about the both of you, and me, you brought some images here where those people standing on that ship, they're looking at a scene of possible, conquest, victory, loss, or anything like that. They're really mapping in their minds what this landscape will allow them to do. And you're creating very different, peaceful, beautiful, gorgeous environments, not the way those guys are thinking, but the way we think, oh, I want to enter this park and have a good experience. So I'm curious how much, what I said earlier, you direct that experience, and you want the visitors to walk that way a little bit and look at that beautiful vista. And what about the ones who are just in their phone and sitting there and never look out? Like, how much control do you want to have over that experience? And then I'll ask Anne a little bit about the limits all the limits that you've referred to, geographic, cultural, metaphysical, etc. But do you want to direct the person who's visiting your sites, or leave them totally alone to stroll through it?
I guess it's neither. It's always a balance, but I think there is a bit of a choreography or scenography or something that happens as you move through the landscape, and there are these sort of prompts or invitations. There are moments, for example, on the High Line where the bench, which is always going north-south, switch to east-west at a particular moment because it's a view of the Statue of Liberty. Or, it's not that you don't realize it unless you're there, and whether or not someone actually sees it or not, but there are moments where the trees sort of open up to the sky, moments where you're compressed between buildings, and we actually amplify that characteristic on the flyover, where it was actually a moment on the High Line at the time was where the tallest buildings were, no longer the tallest buildings. But the trees were growing up to catch the light. There was this grove there. And so we wanted to sort of recreate that feeling of that microclimate of being enclosed and within the canopy of the trees. So I think there are these kind of moments, and they're longer gradients. Sometimes it's a very particular vista or view, but it's kind of this idea of the prospect and refuge, this sort of compression and expansion, and as you're moving through a space, it's sort of unfolding. But I think that the other piece of it is it's meant to be somewhat unscripted, too. The idea is that it is meant to kind of evolve and change and have people use it in spaces that we imagined and spaces that in ways that we never could have imagined. And that's part of the magic of that balance. I think as a landscape architect, the idea of control is like so foreign in some ways, because the medium that you're working with, I mean, we are working with paving and benches and all that stuff, but the living medium is like, I mean, this idea of nature and control always comes up in theory and history, but, you know, you can't. And I think even in mentality, we're now thinking of ways like, instead of fighting the water, like, how do we live with water? How do we, and so even that edge on Gansevoort Peninsula is a resilient sort of tactic that looks at how we deal with sea level rise and how we deal with this idea of both engaging the water, but also being, you know, it lifting up and having layers.
I mean, you said when you went back to Vietnam, I was trying to make sense of what you said. You're trying to, in some ways, access experiences of the past for the first time. That they both were there in the past and not there, and your photographs are staging an encounter with a past that wasn't accessible to you. So I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about that. You got there, you set up your camera, and then you're creating a scene that is allowing you to access something that was already there. There's something in Friedrich which is weird, because we look at the landscapes and we think, well, this looks like something you could find anywhere, and yet it is totally made up. So I'm curious how you use photography to access things not really readily available to us. So that's the other one of the limits. So as I said, Friedrich has so many geographic, physical markers limits. You put in benches and pavement, and then there are other limits to what we can imagine, what we can feel. So could you talk a little bit about that, how your own journey back was not a journey just into the past, but then into your practice of a photographer in the present?
Yeah, I think that experience in Vietnam really made me understand what I love about photography, in that there's so many limitations, right? I can't move a tree, I can't break a wall, but there are many things I can do. Of course, there's some serendipity, you know, going there at the right time, and the light is, you know, by just a half hour, the light's slightly different, or you were expecting sunny weather and suddenly it's foggy and you're disappointed, but then suddenly something else happens, right? So you gotta be attuned to changes and unexpected things. But it's also about control, you know? Where do you stand? And I don't spend that much time looking through my camera again. I walk around and I experience something, and I know exactly where my camera should go, and I get in the dark cloth and make minor changes, but it's really, where do you stand? And I think that I tell my students this, you experience something, you have an idea, and you stand somewhere, and I always think, well, you should try to step back as much as possible. And at one point, your idea is gonna be gone because you're too far. But there is a perfect place where your idea is there because everything comes together in an incredible tension, you know, whether it's the curve of the river, the tree, the aspect, the perspective of this particular thing. So everything comes together, and I think it's just that kind of manipulation. And it also has to do with specificity, which is why I so appreciate the way you've written about the way Frederick paints and the painstaking effort into describing something so precisely. And for me, it's that too. You need to provide a kind of reality, right, in order to let people experience something that they feel connected to, but then also allow them to go beyond it. But I think that real part is really important. And photography, of course, does that so well.
I was just gonna, you know, as you were speaking, and I think there is, of course, this notion of the work that we do as, of course, being maybe these beautiful places, but I think there's also this relationship between, for lack of a better word, like the performative aspects of it and the beauty aspects of it. And I'm someone who actually embraces beauty. I think, you know, you're constantly justifying the work, and in many ways, like, part of the work is also, it is there to sort of inspire, but at the same time, it's doing many things. So our projects are not only, you know, creating these spaces for people to be, but they're reconnecting natural systems, or they're reconnecting, mobility corridors, or they're sparking development, or they're, creating other sorts of things. So it's all intertwined. It's this complex kind of relationship and systems, urban, natural, people, movements, etc.
I want to stay with that moment of beauty and then the two categories that you both invoked, which is wonder and awe, and the sublime. And sort of, to be technical, the sublime is sort of unbounded experiences of something that's transporting, versus beauty, which is bounded experiences. That's sort of one of the Burke or Kant definitions, very sort of academic. And wonder and awe is more sort of, those words are more, they're personal to us. So Emily Dickinson's definition is wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not, a beautiful but bleak condition he has not lived who has not felt, which means you haven't been alive if you haven't felt wonder, but it's not precisely knowing and not precisely knowing not. It's suspended between knowledge, wanting to know, master cognitively something, and actually being pulled into that experience and left there. And Dickinson says, to end my this excursion to Emily here, it's a beautiful condition because it's transporting, and what it teaches us, which is what the romantics around Friedrich say, it teaches us we have a capacity to imagine that we could be more than ourselves. We can transcend our condition. That ties into the political moment he's living in, which is the Enlightenment, which is the overthrow of monarchies and authoritarian rulers, really. And Dickinson has a beautiful but bleak condition because we can never fully master that condition ourselves. So we are transported to the limit of our own capacity, but we can never totally actualize it. And you said wonder, and you said the sublime, and I'm interested in Friedrich using this transport. We are taken to the edge of ourselves and then kind of left there, which allows for this open-ended interpretation, but we're also abandoned there. We're also exposed to something the sublime, which is not positive. It's beauty and terror. And I'm interested in this when you move out of the beautiful as comforting, and I like the fact that you actually said, I'm on the side of beauty. I think it's very important to actually be on the side of beauty these days. Very, very important. And what I'm trying to say, it is a profoundly important existential and political move to be on the side of beauty and wonder and awe, and not to be on the side of, I want to know and understand and master everything. But in your work, you are activating these things to bring the person or the viewer to the limit of their own capacity, but you kind of leave them there. So I want to get to Friedrich. It's not just comforting, nice, romantic. He leaves us stranded or radically exposed to ourselves, and we are kind of alone. And I think the galleries are very beautiful because they're very moving and very enveloping, but you're also alone in a way. And this, can you talk maybe a little bit about this, because you've also, in the catalog, there's this touching on difference between solitude and loneliness, and in your work, when you said finish of your remarks, you said, and you leave the viewer kind of with their own experience. So you're not sort of telling them what to do with it, right?
Well, because you want them to ponder about human existence and about how wonderful and complicated life is. And so, it's a fragment you're providing, and you give them all the cues, and then you kind of let them go. And I think that's really wonderful, and I think great works of art do that. And when I see a moment that I need to photograph, I don't quite understand it, and I think I'm so in awe of what I'm experiencing. All I can do is just think of making the picture. Like I'm on a ship. Okay, where's the horizon line? Do I want it to go up? Do I want to keep it straight? Who is moving? Like, is my light meter working? So it's like all the intuitive, multiple steps you have to do, and you just hope it comes together. And as a photographer, so much of what I do comes down to editing and going through the contact sheets and looking and realizing that sometimes some things are beyond my expectations of what I experience, and sometimes it's completely disappointing. So it comes to all of that, the intuitive, the thinking, knowing where to go, knowing what to kind of look for, what has potential, but then also,
I like this notion of editing, because I feel like it relates to our work too, in that a lot of times people think design is an additive process, but for us, many times it's actually the opposite. It's sort of stripping back and getting the essence of place or amplifying what's there, or sort of almost a process of removal in some ways.
And now I'm going back here to the Monk by the Sea, again on the right, because this is in fact a painting that is arrived at through the process of editing and removal and subtraction. So we know from technical analysis, conservation analysis, x-rays that were done of this painting in Berlin, that Friedrich originally drew ships, a fleet of ships, 3 ships on the horizon and nets on the sand. And so the monk and we as the viewers originally had an objects for our gaze, and we also, there is then more of a narrative suggested there, and there's kind of more clear symbols, right? Ships as symbols for travel or discovery or the course of life. And at some point before this painting was exhibited, Friedrich elected to paint them out. And I have to think he did that because he realized that he decided that that was giving too much information, and that he could better communicate the experience, right? The experience that he wanted to create was better communicated through less.
And when he removes the ships, he takes out the symbolism, he takes out the references. We would know maybe where the ships come from, etc. All this scholarly work has shown every hat means something. This means something. This tower means something. So he's stripping away things that would give us too much information, which is incredibly liberating, but also risks then actually losing us or losing the specificity, and it just means nothing. And that's why I want this term of open-endedness, I'm very cautious about. I say yes, and yet he's so controlled in the way you're describing your work. You're not just sort of standing on the ship and say, oh, let me take a picture. Sort of, it's enormous amounts of work to get into an experience which is uncontrolled. And that, I think, is in Friedrich really remarkable, that he's thinking actively, how little can I give to keep you totally in this picture right here.
Yeah, and I think a kinship with the work that both of you do is that Friedrich's images are very carefully choreographed and calibrated to produce precisely this effect of open-endedness. He has to work very hard as an artist to create this effect of, you know, that we see here, of kind of liberation and being set free, and as you said so beautifully, of putting us again on the edge. And I think that's one point of connection with your work, Anmi, that Friedrich's works try to hold a lot in contradiction, and they put us at a point where we are having to confront a lot of things that are incommensurate and that don't add up or resolve. That the situation in many of his paintings is there's no clear resolution to what we feel and experience.
And he refuses to simplify it.
Yes, there's a real refusal to simplify there.
He allows us, which in our age today, it's harder to say, that our relation to the environment is totally unknown to us. We are placed here and we have really no idea how to relate to it properly. So your work sort of says it, but what is the proper relationship to the river in New York? It hasn't really worked so well. And what he's introducing, it may not just be a material relation of standing in this place, but it has a spiritual dimension. And without that dimension, you're just going to conquer space and see it exclusively as things I can use or they're against me. And to infuse this, your material position with a spiritual question in a kind of secular moment, because he's not religious anymore, it's really powerful, I think, to keep, and that's what you said when you said you want to celebrate beauty, not in a simplified way because you don't like ugliness, but if you don't celebrate beauty, we're going to end up in a very dark place.
Yeah, and I think this notion of juxtaposition, I mean, this is also so much in, I think, our work, et cetera, but I'm always sort of humbled by, I've been spending a lot of time working with the Mississauga First Credit Nation in Canada, and this notion of beauty, like, I think the Western interpretation of beauty is like superficial, but beauty to them is about balance, and it's this balance with nature, with all your relatives, with, I don't know, there's something about that concept that I think is for me, very meaningful.
I'll give you another quote you didn't ask for, but I'll give it to you anyways. So the other poet who is in my head a lot is Rilke, and he defines beauty in the following way. He said, beauty is the beginning of terror because it disdains to destroy us. It's the edge at which we are. There's something so overwhelming we could be touched by, and it disdains to destroy us. It's not malicious, it's neutral to us, but beauty is actually very powerful for Rilke. It's not pretty, it's not makes you feel good, it actually is challenging. And if you go back to your, maybe Anne, the image of those
beauty drains meaning from things, right? And then fills you with emotions. And I mean, I only have problems with it because people question me. You know, they don't associate war with beauty. And I don't think of beauty as pretty. I think of beauty as balance or clarity, you know, or some sort of, so that was the kind of, you know, issues I had to think about a lot.
I want to touch on one question that's sort of in the Friedrich literature, which I happen to not agree with, which is this kind of the precursor to abstraction. And I think the reason, if you go back to a Friedrich painting, he understands gravity in a way. And there's a lot of gravity in these pictures. They are grounded in something. And I think abstraction is not just strip out the beach and then you have Rothko. This is not going in that direction at all. And that's one of my former colleagues, the much missed Robert Rosenblum, who wrote that book on Friedrich to Rothko, and it Americanized, as you illustrated in the catalog, as if Allison is brilliant, sort of, it brings Friedrich out of the horrible legacy of having been tainted and appropriated wrongly by the Nazis and makes him into an American precursor to abstraction. I think gravity plays a huge role in these paintings. I think he thinks a lot about where we stand, where things are, where things fall, the studies of ice, the studies of the quarries, the studies of rocks. There's something about the heaviness or the lightness in which we relate to the world. And that seems completely a different concern to abstraction to me.
Yes, and we know from Friedrich's sketches, we have some in the show, that when he was out in nature, he thought very hard about standpoint and perspective, and he makes little notations on the drawings to indicate where is the horizon line, where is his line of vision, what would be the height of a person if they were in that landscape. This goes back to what you were saying about the viewer. And I think it's important to remember that all of the scenarios that we see in his artwork are based on his own experience of the natural world, moving through the natural world. You know, and so this is actually one of my questions for both of you, which is how does we have a sense of how Friedrich kind of conceptualized this, right, in his work, but do you have to take this experience of moving through the world and either shape it or capture it in a certain way? You know, one of the things that interested me a great deal in, you know, looking through the book on the High Line was how much time you spent up on the High Line moving through that space.
Yeah, I mean, even just looking at this image, I was sort of captured by even the proportion of sky to ground. And I think depending on any site we're working, there are those things too, like there's the specificity of the site, and I'll sort of comment even on that idea of like the rigorous inventory of like the High Line down from like where the paving was crumbling to, you know, the sort of exotic pear tree that was probably a seed that came from one of the trains. But I think this idea too of kind of putting the body in sort of these different experiences, like even so in Domino Park, there's a ramp that sort of comes up, and of course it's like the technicalities of the ramp is it has to be less than 5%, and the slopes to get wheelchairs and, you know, all this stuff up it, but it brings you into contact with the cranes in a way that you would never have that relationship, you know, from the ground. And so it just has a very different perspective, and like bringing the body into that with the High Line, you know, when you cut through the structure as a way to sort of enter it, which you can only do at a few moments because the High Line is owned by multiple owners underneath, but that moment of actually cutting through the structure and getting up close to the hand-riveted steel is a moment, right? And so all of those things are very much, I think, knowing and learning the site. But again, it's your experiences and your perspectives and all of that goes into the decisions that you make. But I do think that it's a huge part of our process, is spending a lot of time not only in the physical place and on site, but also with the both existing communities, people, understanding the politics, the context, the connections, all of it. It's just a very deep amount of work that goes into everything, and a lot of synthesis and a lot of conflict and a lot of consensus building and all of that.
And can you talk a little bit more about when you say you take photographs? You spend a lot of time just walking around the area and being there.
I think all photographers have this fear of being the tourist photographer, Not that you can't make great pictures without spending too much time in a place, but I spent a lot of time back in Vietnam when I started traveling back there. I think it's important to get a feel for the place, understand the culture, and see, how you are as an individual within this new culture. It's not a question of understanding it well. I'm not a photojournalist. I'm not trying to tell the story about this particular culture or the military of Vietnam. I'm an artist, but I think that everything takes time, and the more I'm out there photographing every day, especially when it's difficult to get permission, from morning to night, and now I photograph at night, so I guess I could never stop. So it is important, but I think over time, it's that 10,000-hour thing. I think that I spend less time actually photographing and somehow manage to get as many good pictures just because I'm more skilled or I have a better understanding of what has potential. But, I always try things that may not seem right because, you don't know. And I think experimentation is always great. But I wanted to say how I'm so envious of the work that landscape architects do and the work that land artists do, because you actually create something that someone can experience, and as a painter, as a photographer, we're creating reference to an experience. And so it seems so removed in a way. And, I wanted to know, the experience of looking at art versus actually walking through Michael Heiser's city, which I think is one of the most extraordinary works of art that I've experienced.
The pictures you showed from California, I think, for me at least, they create really a jolt of unrecognition. And you said they are not war, they are rehearsal, they are actual live ammunition, they're real, they're not real. So there's something there where you're teaching us to see places very close to us, around us, that we are trained to overlook, that we are sort of supposed to not notice. And in some ways, if you, the Friedrich, the spruce, and then the thicket, which is just a bunch of shrubbery with a little snow on it, it has no meaning. And yet it is incredibly interesting that someone would take the time, and what we know actually, because it is a painting, we know someone spent time looking at this thing and actually devoted some incredible skill and craft and decision making and all this and cognition, and yet created something that we don't know anything about this little shrubbery there. But we have an experience, and what you're doing here in those pictures and the night pictures, you're taking us to a place that we don't really look at, we can't get access to. There are all sorts of limits, you're barred from entering, etc. And then I think your photographs allow us to remember how much we actually overlook all the time.
Yes, or we take for expected. People have. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think people have preconceived notions about the military, about war, about Vietnam, about everything.
About everything.
Yeah.
Just like we think we know what a spruce looks like.
Yeah.
And then we allow,
absolutely.
whoa, that's what it looks like. And it doesn't look like that at all, because you go to it and you're like, it doesn't look like that. But this painting is something, it vibrates with something because someone actually spent time looking at it. And I think that's your photography saying, if you look a bit longer, you can start to see things you didn't know about yourself.
Yeah, I'm
Not
hoping
just
so.
about that
yeah,
site.
I think there's something about destabilizing the viewer as well. You know, making them feel, yes, it's familiar. Look at how it's described. I kind of know this. I've seen this somewhere. But as you keep going, questions start arising, and I think that's what happens when I look at Friedrich's landscapes.
Well, I mean, I think this notion of the overlooked too, I mean, most of our, because we focus really on work in cities, and most of our projects are actually totally the abandoned, the overlooked, the reimagined, right? From a you know, uncommissioned industrial plant to a landfill to you know, an old rail line, et cetera. I mean, so they're spaces that, or even in the case of the Underline, it's underneath the metro rail. It was just a transit sort of easement. And so I think this idea of sort of reimagining into places that are often overlooked or seen as the sort of, sometimes even have extremely negative connotations. And it's complicated. It's not about just sort of, you know, prettying it up and beautifying it. And many times there is a whole legacy of those infrastructures that created significant barriers between neighborhoods, between, you know, wealth, all of these things. And so figuring out how to create meaningful connections where they were barriers and sort of rethink that is part of the work as well.
Yeah, and I think with Friedrich as well, this is another point of connection, that his work encourages us to look closely and to look again at sites or aspects of the natural world around this. I find this too, just having worked on this exhibition, that I now look much more attentively at my own environment. I am not a trained artist. I'm not a trained landscape architect, so that's not something, right? I look closely at artworks generally. And so that was a surprising outcome for me of this exhibition, that by looking so attentively and then by presenting that to us, it then encourages us also to look more closely. I mean, and I think that is an effect that we become conscious of in his work, that even if the image itself is uninhabited, we are still conscious to a certain extent, both of the artist, right, having at one point looked closely, and then of the fact that we, again, are positioned to look as well. And I think he does often look at sites that are, in his own time, unexceptional, forgotten, overlooked. We have to remember that in Friedrich's era, you know, Italy, that was the definitive, beautiful, you know, that was the acme of the landscape. And if you were an ambitious landscape painter, you went to Italy, because that was, in Europe, that was the most beautiful landscape accessible to you. Friedrich never went to Italy. He said he thought it would wreck his art. And I think he was probably right. I mean, he was also a real homebody, but the sites that he depicts are really local ones. And, you know, in a work like this one, I mean, he's depicting a working mine. I mean, this is a work, Anmi, I know you have done work like this too, that it is about extraction. It's about construction and destruction and the very unbeautiful transformations of the environment that are going on around him. And I think, you know, he does this when he's a war refugee. He's actually fled Dresden. And so this is almost an accidental work that he has then depicted in this very beautiful, finished way.
And I think that's the same. I mean, you know, you might look at the first image I shared of the Presidio tonal tops, and you might think,
I don't know if I can get there fast
it's
enough.
Fine, don't worry about it. And you might think it's beautiful, but this is a bridge over a California Transit Authority roadway, right? I mean, that's what it is, and it's reconnecting the Presidio up at the hilltop down to Crissy Field and the water. But again. So I don't know. I mean, it's hard because we don't try to actually mask all of that, but I think sometimes the interpretation at the end is, and maybe it doesn't matter. If someone goes there and sort of sees the layers and the depth, that's one experience. And if someone goes there and just thinks it's beautiful, that's another experience. And it almost is, maybe it doesn't matter.
In the catalog, you point out that some responses to Friedrich when he exhibited first were outraged because he's basically saying close attention is a form of prayer. People said, how dare you put nature in the place of the divine, because you do not worship at the altar of nature. But he does something, he lets us see things, and he lets us see nature as denatured, and it's not a fantasy of untouched purity. And when you see those two guys looking at the moon, they're tree stumps, they've been cut down, they're limbs that have been severed. There's almost never a tree that hasn't been cut or something that has been touched. And in some ways, I think he wants us to also know we are part of nature, and we have always interacted. It's not nature out there, this amazing thing.
We are nature ourselves.
We are nature, yeah, we are nature. And in some ways, I think, what you also said, really important, I think, earlier, that's why I wanted to repeat that point. You teach photography also at Bard College, and I think for photographers, which all of you have a phone in your pockets, you're all photographers, and to actually spend a lot more time sort of in the experience of trying to understand what you're photographing, rather than just having that camera up there, which is, I think what Friedrich and what your work is saying, be in that experience for a long time, and you may see something you didn't see when you just take out your iPhone and click. And so the depth of engagement, I think that is a lesson. And in some ways, I think it also kind of protects us from a fantasy. There's the earth, we must protect it, we've never interacted, or now we're going to get it right. We will continue to get it wrong, but we have to keep on doing it in a deeply contemplative way.
Yeah, and I think this is one place where I part ways with Friedrich, unbelievably, that he laments not only this kind of, you can see the tree stumps here, this kind of destruction of the natural environment for out of economic need, but he also laments artists who are kind of depicting it in a very straightforward way. He again has this very strong conception of beauty, right? Balance, harmony, that's something that the artist should seek to create, right, through their work of art. But again, I think the point of connection here with the work that you do is that in both cases, these are situations, whether urban situations or the type of thing that you're photographing. My instinct would be often either to look away or to ignore it. I mean, I've lived here for long enough. I remember when the High Line was just this trash-ridden, overgrown, right, site. And these are not places or situations, I think in particular, of these photographs, right, of military exercises that I would normally want or be inclined to look at and to take in. So this, again, is another way in which art then draws you in to confronting something that is otherwise very easy to just set aside.
I'm a teacher, so I'm going to leave you with a riddle and a quiz. So you can go back to the galleries, walk to the Egyptian and then the Greek, and then write to and see that wanderer over the, what is it, Sea of Fog? Don't show it to us, no. So which way is his hair blowing and why? Because his beautiful frock coat is totally stiff and the mists are kind of immobile, but his hair is blowing in a direction. Why is that? So just think about that, and I want to thank Lisa and me and Allison for this.